On a medieval table, bread was so dark and heavy it felt like stone. The pot on the fire held little more than watery cabbage, and in the rafters the last scraps of salted pork dangled like shadows of survival. For peasants, every meal was not comfort. It was combat against hunger, against the seasons, against the church itself. So ask yourself, if this was dinner, would you see it as food or as a reminder of how close starvation always sat at the table? Welcome to the veil of the Middle Ages, where we lift the romantic veil to reveal a hard-to-swallow Middle Ages, right from the brown bread on the peasant's table. To understand the diet of a medieval peasant, you must first understand the world that controlled their table. At the bottom of the feudal hierarchy stood the serfs, or villains, bound to the soil and sworn to their lord. Their days were measured not by the rhythm of choice but by obligation, ploughing, sowing, harvesting and hauling not only for their own families but for the church and the noble who claimed their labour as a right. The tithe, a tenth of everything they produced, was demanded by the parish, filling vast tithe barns with grain. Much of it, in truth, would rot away under the teeth of rats or be fouled with their droppings, but that loss was the peasant's burden, not the church's. To the medieval farmer, the barn was both altar and prison, proof that faith and hunger were inseparable companions. Home was no sanctuary. The average peasant's house was a timber frame stuffed with wattle and daub, a single smoky room lined with straw. Cooking, sleeping and living all blurred together, often in the company of animals. Chickens, sheep or even the family cow were ushered inside at night, not out of love but necessity. Wolves and thieves roamed the countryside, and to lose an animal was to lose food, milk or wool. Yet sharing a roof with beasts meant filth, fleas and vermin. The air was thick with smoke from the central hearth, where a single iron pot hung over the fire, the same pot that simmered thin pottage by day and smoked cuts of meat by night. If you imagine a kitchen filled with the aroma of herbs and roasted meats, erase it. What lingered in these huts was more often the acrid sting of ash, the sour tang of dung, and the constant itch of lice. And then came the cruelest season of all, the hungry gap. Between the end of winter and the first harvest of spring, when grain bins were nearly empty and salted meat was gnawed down to scraps, families stretched meals with desperation. Pottage grew thinner, bread smaller, and the line between fasting for God and starving from want blurred into one. Children learned early that the year was a cycle of feast and famine, and that survival depended not only on the soil but on divine mercy. Even when food was available, it was never truly free. Lords claimed the rights of the mill, yet forcing peasants to grind their grain in the lord's mill house for a fee. The same was true for bakehouses, where villagers brought their dough to be baked in the communal oven, paying a gain in coin or grain. A loaf of bread was not simply baked, it was taxed, weighed and watched. The irony. The poorest meals often came with more paperwork than nourishment, more rules than calories. As some peasants quipped bitterly, their dinner table had stricter regulations than the kingdom's courts. Across Europe, geography shaped flavour. In the damp fields of northern England and Scandinavia, rye, oats and barley dominated, baked into coarse brown loaves and washed down with ale. Butter, cheese and porridge formed the backbone of survival. Meanwhile, in the sunlit valleys of Italy or along the coasts of Spain, peasants clung to olives, beans, lentils and the sturdier strains of wheat. The sea delivered salted fish to markets, while goats provided milk that could be coaxed into hard cheese. To travel from one end of Europe to the other was to cross not only landscapes but kitchens, each table reflecting the soil and sky that governed it. In the end, a medieval peasant's meal was never their own. It belonged to the weather, to the landlord, to the tithe collector, and to the rhythms of church bells. Bread might be baked in their home, but it carried the fingerprints of millers, priests, and lords. Faith and famine sat side by side at the table, and each meal was seasoned as much with obligation as with salt. If you rose with a medieval peasant, the first thing you would notice is how little time was wasted before eating. At dawn, after hours of labour in the fields or with the animals, breakfast was not a feast but a necessity, fuel to face the day. A rough heel of dark bread cut from a loaf of rye or barley was paired with a wedge of hard cheese, often dry and sharp. On better mornings there might be beans or peas simmered into a paste the night before, eaten cold with bread. And to wash it down? Not milk, not water, but small ale. A weak, barely alcoholic beer brewed in every village household. It was safer than stagnant water and provided calories enough to start a day of toil. Even children drank it, for the alternative was often sickness. By midday, the hunger from labour returned. Lunch was centred around the peasant's eternal companion, the pottage. In the iron cauldron that never truly left the fire, scraps of whatever was available simmered into a watery stew. Cabbage leaves, leeks, onions and turnips might be joined by a handful of barley or oats, thickening the broth. Herbs from the garden, parsley, sage or thyme, added life to what otherwise would be tasteless mush. Sometimes a sliver of salted fish or a few scraps of bacon would be tossed in, transforming the ordinary into something approaching luxury. A trencher, a slab of day-old bread used as both plate and sponge, caught the drippings, soaking up the broth until it too was eaten. To a peasant, the trencher was tableware, napkin, and second course all in one. The afternoon brought not leisure but more work, and by evening, hunger had sharpened again. Dinner was the heartiest meal of the day, though hearty was relative. The cauldron's contents were richer by nightfall, thicker from hours of simmering, sometimes bulked with beans, peas, or a scrap of pork fat. On rare days, a cut of smoked bacon, hung from the rafters since winter, would be carved down into the pot, releasing its flavour like a treasure long guarded. The smell alone was a reminder that survival meant patience, planning, and faith that the meat would last until the next slaughter season. Food was not always cooked at home. For villagers who lived near towns, markets provided ready-made meals, pies filled with minced beef, pork, or fish, sold hot by street vendors. A peasant spending the day at market might spend a penny on such food, tasting the bustle of urban life in every bite. Yet these meals were indulgences. Most peasants ate what their fields, gardens and foraging hands provided. The contrast between town and countryside was sharp. Urban dwellers with coins could taste variety, while rural peasants lived by the rhythm of their own cauldron. In every household, simple tools defined the cuisine. Wooden ladles stirred endlessly in clay or iron pots. Earthenware bowls, often chipped and rough, carried the steaming stew. Communal bakehouses, glowing red with shared ovens, baked loaves that bore the marks of the Lord's mill. Preservation too was a craft. Meat was packed in salt or suspended in vinegar. Fat was poured over leftovers to seal them from decay. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. Daily meals were not banquets, they were survival made routine, and yet, within the smoke-filled hut, there was warmth. The tearing of bread by hand, the passing of the ladle, the sip of ale shared between adults and children alike. These moments were ordinary, but they were also deeply human. To sit at the table of a peasant was to witness endurance itself, a family sustained not by feasts but by the quiet ritual of bread, broth and belief. To live as a medieval peasant was to live in rhythm with the land. Every bite of food, every crumb of bread was tied to the turning of the year. Survival was not a straight line but a circle, seed, harvest, feast, famine, repeated endlessly, each year testing the body and the spirit. autumn was a season of labour and preparation. The fields, heavy with grain, demanded long days of reaping. Families worked side by side, cutting, binding and hauling sheaves into barns before the rains spoiled them. Alongside grain came beans, peas, onions and cabbages, each gathered and stored as carefully as treasure. Meat animals were fattened through the summer, and by late autumn, slaughter began. Cattle too old to milk, pigs grown plump on scraps, and sheep past their use were killed in swift succession. This was no grim cruelty, but necessity. Better to preserve the meat in salt and smoke than to watch the animals starve through winter. The rafters filled with bacon, hams and sausages. The air smelled of smokehouses, tangy brine, and fat dripping into embers. For a brief moment, abundance was everywhere, and families could look ahead with cautious relief. Winter, however, was not kind. The smoked meats hung like silent guardians of survival, rationed carefully week by week. Fat rendered from pigs or cows became as precious as gold, ladled into pottage or spread on bread. When the snow fell, the countryside turned inward. The forager's path yielded little more than nuts stashed away earlier, or a honeycomb harvested in late summer and guarded until now. Meals grew repetitive, heavy with salted fish and cured pork, but the calories meant life. Families huddled around the hearth, measuring time not by clocks, but by how quickly the larder emptied. And then came the cruelest chapter of the year, the hungry gap. From late winter into early spring, when the salted meat dwindled and the last sacks of grain grew thin, peasants lived on whatever scraps could be coaxed into a meal. Pottage was watered down until it was little more than flavoured broth. Loaves of bread shrank, sometimes mixed with peas, beans, or even acorns to stretch the flour. To stave off hunger, families added ale to the pot, or whey, from cheese-making, thickening the broth enough to trick the stomach into believing it was satisfied. It was in these months that children learned patience, and parents learned endurance, their eyes fixed on the first green shoots that promised another harvest. Yet nature was not only cruel. Summer brought its own relief. Gardens flourished with leeks, garlic and cabbage. Orchards gave apples and pears, while hedgerows filled with berries. Foragers gathered mushrooms, chestnuts and herbs, weaving wild flavours into daily meals. Streams teemed with fish, and bees hummed across the fields, offering honey to sweeten life's bitterness. The wheel of the year turned, and with it came moments of plenty. And when the harvest was good, so too were the festivals. Feasts followed fairs and holy days, and even peasants found their pots richer than usual. Fresh meat was stewed with vegetables, ale flowed more freely, and the monotony of the hungry gap felt for a brief night like a distant memory. The church calendar itself gave rhythm to the table. Saints' days, harvest festivals, and Easter all marked occasions when food could be more than survival. It could be joy. A family's pottage, normally thin and humble, might thicken into something resembling stew, fragrant with herbs, salt, and the rare luxury of meat. But joy was temporary. The wheel would always turn again. A bad harvest meant not only hunger but despair, famine spreading like a shadow across villages. Even in good years, every family lived with the knowledge that winter and its hungry gap would return. And so each season was a negotiation. Eat now or save for later, celebrate today or pray for tomorrow. For the medieval peasant, food was never just food. It was a constant reminder that nature was both provider and punisher. It was the echo of the plough, the crackle of the smokehouse, the silence of the hungry gap, and the laughter of feast days. To eat was to survive the cycle, and to survive was to wait for the wheel to turn once more. If the seasons ruled the fields, the church ruled the stomach. For a medieval peasant, the calendar of meals was not only agricultural, it was spiritual. The toll of a church bell dictated more than prayers. It decided what could and could not be eaten. On ordinary weeks, 3 days, Wednesday, Friday and Saturday, were marked as fast days. This did not always mean abstaining from food entirely, but it did mean sacrifice. Meat was forbidden, along with dairy and eggs. What remained was bread, vegetables and fish, often salted, dried or pickled to last through the year. For peasants, this was no dramatic shift. Meat was rare enough already. But still, the rules were strict, and breaking them was not only a sin but a risk to the soul. A farmer could toil 12 hours behind a plough and still face the evening with nothing more than a thin bowl of cabbage pottage and a sliver of herring. And then came Lent, the true test of endurance. Stretching 40 days and nights and later extended to 46 with the addition of Sundays, it stripped the table bare. No meat, no eggs, no dairy, no milk. Even the peasants, who depended on hard labour to survive, were expected to obey. Exceptions were made for children, the elderly, beggars and pilgrims, but for most, the rules were absolute. Daily meals shrank to one modest portion, eaten after evening prayers. Ash Wednesday and Good Friday demanded complete abstinence, leaving workers to labour on empty stomachs while the church preached the cleansing of the soul. For the poor, Lent blurred into the hungry gap when food stores were already scarce. Salted fish became the anchor of survival. Herring, eels and dried cod crowded the cauldrons, boiled until the salt gave way to flavouring herbs and barley. It was monotonous, but it was sanctioned. The irony was inescapable. Peasants fasted not because they chose humility, but because they had little else to eat. Faith simply baptized hunger. Meanwhile, in the halls of the nobility, fasting looked very different. While peasants struggled to flavour their thin pottage of fish and leeks, the wealthy dined on elaborate substitutes, mock roasts sculpted from almond paste, lampreys stewed in wine, swans redressed in their feathers to parade across the table. What the poor endured as hardship, the elite transformed into spectacle. The church's rules were technically the same for all, but privilege found loopholes. On the village street, the scent was of boiled herring. In the manor, it was spice-laden dishes gleaming under candlelight. Yet hidden in this hardship was a strange advantage. Long stretches of enforced fasting forced variety into the diet. With meat forbidden, peasants leaned on grains, beans, lentils, nuts and herbs. Wild greens and garden cabbages filled the pot, and fish from rivers and coasts became staples. Though they would not have named it so, this shift sometimes spared them from the deficiencies of a purely meat-heavy diet. The irony, again, was thick. What felt like punishment might, on occasion, have been protection. The liturgical year turned the dinner table into a mirror of faith. Advent, Lent, feast days and saints' celebrations all demanded different meals. Holy days meant shared bread, festivals meant brief abundance, and penance meant emptiness. To a peasant, the kitchen was an altar as much as the church nave. The fire under the cauldron burned with the same authority as the candles on the altar. Still, resentment simmered. To work dawn till dusk, to feed the tithe barn with one hand and your children with the other, only to be told that God required more restraint. It weighed heavily. Faith was salvation, but it was also discipline enforced meal by meal. Even as villagers bowed their heads before bread and fish, they knew that somewhere beyond their fields nobles feasted in silk halls. In the end, the medieval peasant's table was as much a reflection of heaven as it was of earth. Each meal was a prayer, each hunger pang a sermon. Salted fish and barley bread were not only food but instruments of obedience, reminders that even the act of eating was tethered to faith. The church bell marked the hours, but it also marked the flavour of the pot. For the medieval peasant, salvation always came with a side of hunger. If hunger was a fact of medieval life, it was not only nature that enforced it. Laws, taxes and monopolies tightened the noose around the peasant's stomach as surely as famine or plague. To eat was never free. It was always entangled in rules written by lords, kings and councils, who controlled not only the land but the very loaf of bread and mug of ale on the table. Start with the forests. To the untrained eye, a wood teeming with deer, boar, and game birds might look like abundance waiting to be hunted. But in the Middle Ages, the right to hunt was jealously guarded by the nobility. The hart and the wild boar belonged to the king, the deer and the pheasant to the local lord. A peasant caught poaching could be fined heavily, maimed, or even executed. The law reduced the forest from a pantry to a prison, its riches locked behind invisible walls of privilege. At best, a farmer might set snares for rabbits or hares, or catch mice and small birds. Larger prey was forbidden fruit, deadly to pursue. The same restrictions extended to rivers and lakes. Fish swam in abundance, but permission was required to cast a net or drop a line. A stream beside your own field might belong, in law, not to you but to your lord. To trespass into that water was to trespass against feudal authority. And so, even when nature overflowed, access was throttled by law. If the forest and river were closed pantries, the marketplace was a cage of another sort. In towns across England, the Assize of bread and ale, the statute passed in the 13th century, dictated the weight and price of every loaf and every jug of beer. In theory, this was meant to protect the people, preventing bakers and brewers from cheating their customers. In practice, it meant endless scrutiny, inspections and fines that hit hardest at the poor. A loaf was weighed against official measures, its size shrinking whenever grain prices rose. So while peasants bit into bread and swallowed ale every day, many found themselves hungrier, not fuller. Bread became the very symbol of inequality, baked to regulation, yet never sufficient. Grinding the grain was another hurdle. Mills were rarely free to use. Lords demanded that peasants bring their harvest to the manor's mill, paying in kind or coin for every sack of flour ground. To skirt the mill was to risk punishment. To use it was to part with precious grain. The village bakehouse was no different. The communal ovens charged fees for every loaf baked. A simple crust of bread carried with it layers of cost, the toll of the miller, the demand of the baker, the weight of the lord's monopoly. In truth, a peasant's loaf was not just flour and water, it was obligation baked into crust. And yet, bread was never uniform across medieval society. In towns and among the wealthy, white bread, wastel, baked from finely sifted wheat, was the prize staple. Soft and pale, resembling cake more than bread. For peasants, brown bread of rye, oats or barley was the norm, dense and heavy. Even at the level of a crumb, class was visible. To eat white bread was to display status. To chew through dark crust was to announce poverty. In markets, guilds enforced quality and price, but no regulation erased the difference between what a lord ate at his table and what a villager chewed at the hearth. Ale, too, was bound by law. Women often brewed small ale at home, selling surplus to neighbours. But the Assize demanded inspections and fines for brews that were too weak, too strong, or too short in measure. The irony was sharp. Peasants drank ale not for pleasure, but because water was unsafe, and yet even that necessity was wrapped in legal cords. Imagine being fined for the very drink you needed to survive. The medieval table was thus a battlefield of hidden costs. A rabbit snared without permission could cost you your hand. A loaf baked outside the lord's oven could cost you your grain. A jug of ale judged too strong could cost you your coin. For peasants, meals were not simply a matter of harvest and hunger, but of navigating a thicket of rules designed to remind them who truly owned their bread. It is tempting to imagine the medieval diet as shaped by soil, weather and labour, and it was. But just as important were parchment and seal, decree in Assize. The wheel of law ground as surely as the millstone, and every peasant meal carried its imprint. Bread, ale and fish were more than food. They were symbols of authority, rationed not by nature's limits but by man's laws. History can drown us in numbers and decrees, but life in the Middle Ages was lived one meal at a time by people with names, families, and empty stomachs. To step into their kitchens is to see the raw reality behind the tithe, the assize, and the salted barrel. Elise of Lincoln, 1321. The rain had been falling for weeks, beating the thatched roof of Elise's cottage until the beams groaned under the weight of water. In the tithe barn, the Lord's grain was spoiled, sacks moulding from the damp, the smell of rot so strong it clung to her hair even when she left. For Elise and her children, the hungry gap had come early. The salted pork was gone, the last onion sprouted green and soft in the corner, and the pottage pot now simmered with little more than beans and a few leeks pulled from the muddy ground. Her children slurped the thin broth without complaint, too weary to protest, their bellies growling louder than the storm outside. Elise looked at their faces and thought of the priest's sermon about endurance as penance. She wanted to laugh or to weep, but instead she stirred the pot again, letting steam rise into the rafters already blackened by smoke. In the silence of that night, the cottage smelled of nothing but smoke and salt, though neither was in her pot. Martin, son of the miller. Martin had grown up among the grindstones, the steady creak of the mill wheel, as constant as his heartbeat. His father, a miller by trade, was no stranger to suspicion. Miller's thumb was the village joke, that somehow the man who handled everyone's grain always managed to keep a little more for himself. When the Assize inspectors came, scales in hand, they found the bread too light, the flour too scarce. His father was fined, humiliated before the parish. But Martin knew the truth. The family had eaten no more than anyone else. The fees demanded by the Lord for every sack ground left less flour to sell, less to bake, less to feed the village. Rumours spread quicker than fire in straw. Some villagers cursed the miller as a thief. Others muttered that the assize itself was the real thief, stealing bread from their mouths while pretending to protect them. Martin watched the argument unfold. His father bent under shame and wondered how justice could weigh so heavily on a man already crushed by stones. That night, when bread was shared around their table, the crust was chewed in silence, the only taste in the air, the bitterness of smoke and salt. Ursus, the fisherman. On the coast, the sea was both tyrant and saviour. Ursus rose before dawn, his nets heavy with herring, the salt spray stinging his eyes. Fasting days, when the church forbade meat, were his chance to trade fish for bread. In the village square, he swapped barrel after barrel of silver-scaled herring for coarse loaves of rye bread. But one winter, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. Waves smashed boats, shattered nets, and drove fish ashore in staggering numbers. For once, the sea gave more than it took. Ursus and his neighbours hauled the bounty into baskets, smokehouses and barrels, preserving what they could before the rot set in. That Easter, for the first time in memory, no one in the village went hungry. Pottage bubbled with fish, bread was dipped in broth, and children licked their fingers clean. For Ursus, the storm had been a miracle, a feast delivered on the tide. As laughter rose from the houses and smoke drifted over the shore, the air smelled once more of smoke and salt. This time the scent of plenty. 3 people. 3 stories, each bound by the same truth. Survival was measured not by feast days or harvests, but by whether the pot held enough to quiet a growling stomach. Behind every law and sermon there were hands stirring pottage, breaking bread, or gutting fish. And in the end, whether in rain-soaked Lincoln, beside a creaking mill, or on a storm-tossed coast, the memory that lingered was always the same, the heavy smell of smoke and salt. Walk into a supermarket today and the sheer abundance is staggering. Rows of polished apples shipped from half a world away, gleaming cuts of meat wrapped in plastic, and entire aisles of bread that never seem to run out. For us, hunger is a choice, a skipped meal, a diet, a fast undertaken voluntarily. But for the medieval peasant, the table was always on trial. The pantry was not a brightly lit store, but the uncertain generosity of the forest, the river, and the soil. To run out of bread was not an inconvenience, it was catastrophe. The hungry gap loomed every year, a spectre no supermarket aisle could banish. And yet, there is irony in this comparison. Our modern diets, unlimited by season, often chase novelty instead of need. For peasants, eating seasonally was not a wellness trend, it was survival. They knew that leeks and cabbages came in winter, berries and herbs in summer, apples and pears in autumn. They mastered fermentation, salting and smoking, not as hobbies but as sciences born of desperation. Sauerkraut, smoked ham, salted fish, all were pieces of folk chemistry that carried them through the months when nature offered little. In an age without refrigerators, they created one of their own, built from smoke, salt, and patience. The Black Death offers another unsettling mirror. In the mid-14th century, when plague swept across Europe and millions died, something strange happened at the table. With so many mouths gone, food grew more available for those who remained. Wages rose and suddenly even peasants found themselves eating more meat, drinking more ale, and living, ironically, better than before. It was a cruel paradox. Tragedy enriched the survivors. History reminds us that disaster doesn't always distribute suffering equally. Sometimes catastrophe leaves behind both grief and unexpected prosperity. There is also the legacy of class, visible even in the simplest loaf. To the medieval poor, brown bread made from rye or oats was daily fare, while the wealthy flaunted white loaves of finely sifted wheat. Today, the symbolism has reversed. Dark, whole-grain bread is sold at a premium, while white bread is the cheap staple. Yet the lesson remains. Food is never just sustenance. It is a marker of status, identity, and inequality, as true in the fluorescent lit aisles of today as in the smoky cottages of the 14th century. Perhaps most surprisingly, the so-called poverty of the peasant diet sometimes shielded them in ways we forget. Their meals, rich in grains, beans, vegetables, and occasional fish, could be remarkably balanced compared to the excess of noble feasts, heavy with roasted swan, venison, and cream. The monotony of pottage may have spared them some of the illnesses of overindulgence. What they lacked in luxury, they compensated for with endurance. Still, the psychological burden was immense. To live always with the memory of famine, to ration salted pork by the ounce, to fear the rot in the tithe barn. This was survival under constant threat, and yet it bred resilience. Families knew how to stretch a pot, to forage for mushrooms, to trade fish for bread, to save seed for spring, even when hunger gnawed at their bellies. These were not just survival skills, but cultural inheritance, passed down in habits, prayers, and folk wisdom. When we look at our own tables today, overflowing, global, limitless, it is worth remembering what theirs meant. The peasant meal was not merely calories consumed, it was obedience to law, submission to the church, negotiation with nature, and a daily rehearsal of society's hierarchies. Every loaf of bread carried the weight of lords and millers, every salted fish carried the toll of the sea. And in that sense, the legacy of the medieval peasant table is still with us. Our modern food systems are just as political, just as unequal, just as tied to forces beyond our control. We may no longer fear the hungry gap, but we live with echoes of it, in shortages, in prices, in the politics of grain and oil. The medieval peasant reminds us that food is never just food. It is power, it is survival, and it is the fragile glue of society. Because in the end, a peasant's meal did more than feed the body. It fed the order of the Middle Ages itself, and, at times, it shook it. In the end, the humble peasant meal was never just bread, never just pottage. It was a reflection of every force that ruled medieval life. The church dictated when to fast and when to feast. The Lord demanded his share from the mill, the oven, and the tithe. The seasons decided whether the pot brimmed with cabbage or scraped empty at the bottom. All of it, faith, law, and nature, was baked into the coarse brown loaf that sat on the peasant's table. That bread was more than food. It was obedience, survival, and sometimes quiet defiance. So imagine yourself there, in a smoky cottage, staring at salted fish and rye bread, listening to the church bell toll. Would you trade away the taste of meat for 46 days in order to secure heaven's promise? Or would hunger and hardship test your faith as much as your body? Thank you for watching Vale of the Middle Ages. If you'd like us to sample another corner of the medieval table, be it feast, famine, or forbidden flavour, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so that each week we can lift the lid on another pot of pottage and uncover what truly simmered beneath the veil of history.